The history of rugby football. Rugby is a collective name for the family of team sports of rugby union and rugby league, as well as the earlier forms of football from which both games, as well as Australian rules football and gridiron football, evolved. The two variants of gridiron football, the Canadian football and, to a lesser extent, American football, were once considered forms of rugby football but are seldom now referred to as such. In fact, the governing body of Canadian football, Football Canada, was known as the Canadian Rugby Union as late as 1967, more than 50 years after the sport parted ways with the established rules of rugby union or league. Rugby football was thought to have been started about 1845 at Rugby School in Rugby, Warwickshire, England, although forms of football in which the ball was carried and tossed date to medieval times. Rugby split into two sports in 1895, when 21 clubs split from the Rugby Football Union to form the Northern Rugby Football Union, later renamed the Rugby Football League in 1922, in the George Hotel, Huddersfield, over broken time payments to players who took time off from work to play the sport, thus making rugby league the first code to turn professional and pay players. Rugby union turned professional 100 years later in 1995, following the 1995 Rugby World Cup in South Africa. The respective world governing bodies are World Rugby, the Rugby Union, and the Rugby League International Federation, the Rugby League. Rugby football was one of many versions of football played at English public schools in the 19th century. Although rugby league initially used rugby union rules, they are now wholly separate sports, with rugby league being much more similar to gridiron football. In addition to these two codes, both American and Canadian football evolved from rugby football in the beginning of the 20th century. Following the 1895 split in rugby football, the two forms rugby league and rugby union differed in administration only. Soon the rules of rugby league were modified, resulting in two distinctly different forms of rugby. Rugby union would not become an openly professional sport until 100 years later. The Olympic form of rugby is known as rugby sevens. In this form of the game, each team has 7 players on the field at one time playing 7-minute halves. The rules and pitch size are the same as rugby union. The history of rugby union follows from various football games long before the 19th century, but it was not until the middle of that century that the rules were formulated and codified. The code of football, later known as rugby union, can be traced to 3 events. The first set of written rules in 1845, the Blackheath Club's decision to leave the Football Association in 1863, and the formation of the Rugby Football Union in 1871. The code was originally known simply as rugby football. It was not until a schism in 1895 over the payment of players, which resulted in the formation of the separate code of rugby league, that the name rugby union was used to differentiate the original rugby code. For most of its history, rugby was a strictly amateur football code, and the sports administrators frequently imposed bans and restrictions on players who they viewed as professional. It was not until 1995 that rugby union was declared an open game, and thus professionalism was sanctioned by the code's governing body, World Rugby, then known as the International Rugby Football Board, IRFB. The history of rugby league as a separate form of rugby football goes back to 1895 in Huddersfield, West Riding of Yorkshire, when the Northern Rugby Football Union broke away from England's established Rugby Football Union to administer its own separate competition. Similar schisms occurred later in Australia and New Zealand in 1907. Gradually, the rugby played in these breakaway competitions evolved into a distinctly separate sport that took its name from the professional leagues that administered it. Rugby league in England went on to set attendance and player payment records, and rugby league in Australia became the most watched sport on television. The game also developed a significant place in the culture of France, New Zealand, and several other Pacific Island nations, such as Papua New Guinea, where it has become the national sport.